Thank you very much, and good morning to you all from Brussels, and thank you for joining us. My name is Fiona Wollensack. I'm a Policy Officer at the EU Energy Initiatives Partnership Dialogue Facility, the EUEI PDF, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. I'd like to welcome you all to this, the 14th webinar in the series on resilience that's an initiative of CORE, the knowledge sharing platform on resilience of the Informed programme, which is funded by the European Union and is being implemented by the Food and Agricultural Organization's Strategic Programme on Resilience. This series of webinars is co-hosted by the FAO Strategic Programme on Resilience, by the European Union Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development, DG DevCo, and by the Learn for Dev network. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping points. Today's webinar, it'll last about an hour and 45 minutes, and it is being recorded. You'll all receive a link at the end of the webinar so that you can review the presentations again. If you'd like to pose questions or if you've got any comments, then please do so. You can do so during or after the presentations from today's speakers, and you can do that using the chat box function, which you'll find at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. All of the participants' microphones have been turned off just to avoid any disruption or background noise, but as I say, do make yourself heard by posing your questions. If any of you would like to tweet about today's event, you're warmly welcome and invited to do so. Please feel free to use the hashtags KS4Resilience, that's with the number 4, and UNFAO. Now, a bit about today's webinar. We'll be hosting the second webinar from the series on SAFE, the interagency initiative focused on safe access to fuel and energy. As you may well be aware, safe and sustainable access to energy is being increasingly recognized as a human right. It's essential for the safety, for the well-being, and the productivity of the populations and the people that the humanitarian community serves. It's also essential for social and economic development because it offers opportunities for improved lives and economic progress. In the first of this mini-series of webinars, which was held last week, we heard about key concepts and terms related to energy in emergencies and in protracted crises. We heard about the multi-sectoral risks and challenges associated with the collection and use of traditional biomass fuels. And we also heard about how organizations are coordinating and working together, how they're collaborating to build resilience by responding to the energy needs of affected populations. Switching to today's webinar, the second in this mini-series, we'll present how opportunities and challenges related to linking the humanitarian and development approaches and opportunities and challenges to building resilience can be addressed through energy access. We'll focus our presentations today on tools and case studies of energy interventions on the ground and in protracted crisis contexts. So we're very much looking at the how-to today. Today, therefore, we'll cover the role of energy access in the migration debate and in transcending the humanitarian and development divide. We'll look at the challenges and opportunities of market-based approaches to ensure energy access in humanitarian settings. And we'll be assessing wood fuel supply and demand in order to improve energy access in refugee camps. Specifically, that's an example from Uganda, and we'll have an example from Darfur in Sudan, where we'll look at energy and livelihood interventions. Let me briefly introduce our speakers for today's webinar. First, we'll hear from Anja Rode. She's a long-standing expert in international development, working for the German Agency for Development Cooperation, GIZ. After working in-country for GIZ in both Latin America and Africa, Anja has been working for nearly 10 years by now in renewable energy access, and that includes in humanitarian settings. Today, Anja will draw on her wealth of practical expertise to outline the challenges and opportunities of using market-based approaches to ensure energy access in humanitarian settings. Our second presentation today will be a joint presentation to be held by Andrea de Cruz and Artur Gianventu. Andrea is an environment officer at UNHCR. She's an environmental specialist with a background in conservation and development. She joined UNHCR in 2005 and has been providing support for country offices globally in her function as Environment Officer, and she works with a focus there on Africa. Before joining UNHCR, Andrea worked with CARE International in Papua New Guinea on community-based adaptation programs, and she worked with the cheetah conservation in Botswana on community-based predator conservation. Arto is a forest inventory and energy specialist at the FAO's Forestry Department, and there he's working as a technical advisor on Woodfuel supply and demand assessments and on planning forest management in displacement settings. Arto joined FAO in 2003 and has worked to provide support at the global and at the country level in the fields of bioenergy, forest assessment and monitoring, forest management, food security and rural development in several countries in Africa. Together, Andrea and Arto will focus on the issue of wood fuel supply and demand and how to improve energy access in refugee camps in Uganda. We'll round off today's presentations with one from Daphne Calles, who's the Safe Global Coordinator at the World Food Programme. Since 2004, Daphne has been responsible for the development, coordination, and for scaling up the World Food Programme's safe access to fuel and energy in her role as Safe Global Coordinator. In this position, she's focused on energy and energy-related issues linked to gender, to nutrition, to protection, education, health, and environment. She's also the co-chair of the Safe Working Group, a consortium of key partners working to meet the energy needs of crisis-affected populations. Before taking up her position at WFP, Daphne was a senior communications and PR advisor to companies including Nike, Nivea, Emirates, and Shell, as well as for several small sustainable community development programs in Uganda. So Daphne will be drawing on her wealth of experience to focus on energy and livelihood interventions in Darfur. Before I give the floor to our first speaker, I'd once again like to invite you all to make comments, to pose questions, and to use the chat box function in the bottom right-hand corner of your screens. We'll be picking up on those in the Q&A session, which will follow the presentations. Now, just by way of a bit of context and to frame today's discussions, I'd like to share a bit about the work that the EU Energy Initiatives Partnership Dialogue Programme facility has been working on when it comes to energy access and the migration debate. So the EUEI PDF is a flexible instrument for promoting sustainable energy and equitable development. We're a multi-donor facility funded by the European Commission and 6 European member states, and we're hosted by GIZ, the German Agency for International Development. We've got about 13 years of experience in some 35 countries, as you can see from the map, across the world. And we're working on topics including energy access, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and climate change. What exactly do we do? Well, we work in 5 key areas, and those include fostering coherence in energy development cooperation. We work to facilitate strategic political dialogue. We offer demand-driven policy advice, capacity building, and institutional building for various countries. We mobilize support for private investments in renewable energy, and we strengthen renewable energy research, innovation, and skills development. So that's what the EUEI PDF does and what I'm working on. But you may well be asking, how does that link to the migration debate? Well, the EUEI PDF is a bit of a knowledge generation and innovation function for our donors. And as such, we've been drawing on our long-standing expertise in energy and development, and we've been looking at that pressing issue of migration. We have been working with various partners to draw up a paper on the role of energy in the migration debate, collaborating with different organizations, experts, and initiatives to discuss and review and develop that publication. And it's available on the EUEI PDF website via our flagship publications. I'll come briefly to the key findings of our research, and you can find out more via the publication. The link is available as well here in the webinar and will be made available afterwards. So what are the key findings of our research? Well, first up, it should be underlined that energy is an enabler of economic activity and for promoting livelihoods. Then, as you'll see from this illustration on the slide, and as you can well imagine, energy plays different roles in different stages of migration. It's essential it's an essential prerequisite for poverty reduction, for the provision of basic services, improving health, education, and for women's empowerment. When it comes to migration, energy plays different roles at different stages of the decision to migrate, both before migration occurs and after it has taken place. Looking at the left-hand side of that diagram you see before you, and the context of before, energy's role before migration occurs, it's been found through our research that energy can help prevent and alleviate the structural causes of irregular migration, helping to mitigate economic and environmental drivers of migration. When it comes to the economic drivers of migration, it can help improve livelihoods, promote productive uses of energy, upscale value chains, and enable the provision of basic services, all of which can help provide people with opportunities and reduce their requirement to migrate. When it comes to the environmental drivers of migration, there's the opportunity of renewable energy to improve opportunities and to decrease environmental degradation, which is often a cause of migration. But then, once migration has occurred, energy again plays different roles. Migration is primarily a rural to urban movement, and energy obviously plays an important role in offering opportunities to people who have moved from the countryside to urban or peri-urban areas, and provides, in this context, obviously an opportunity to generate co-benefits between recently arrived migrants and local populations. When it comes to acute migration to the humanitarian settings, their energy, sustainable energy in particular, can decrease the running costs and the hazards of energy use in humanitarian settings. That includes reducing exposure to gender-based violence in camps. And additionally, as elsewhere, energy can provide economic opportunities and be a catalyzer for development, which generates benefits also for host communities, including in those acute humanitarian settings. That sort of rounds off my little presentation about our work, and I hope sets the context for today's presentations. And so, on that note, I'd like to invite Anya to hold her presentation and tell us a bit about the market-based opportunities. Anya?
Thank you very much for inviting me to hold this presentation on energy access for refugees and host communities. As Fiona has been introducing, I was asked to talk about the role of energy in transcending the humanitarian and development divide. And as a second topic, have a look at the challenges and opportunities of using market-based approaches to ensure energy access in humanitarian settings. And please take into account that GIZ is not a humanitarian but a development actor. So I will look at our projects with the experiences that we can project to situations of protracted crisis. The graph you're seeing here might be familiar to some of you or most of you. Just a quick look. It shows priorities and responsibilities in refugee camps. You might have noticed that energy is not mentioned here. The graph shows the responsibilities for, let's say, education, for food security, health, nutrition, etc. But energy is not mentioned. What does that mean on the ground? It could either be, if you look at a camp setting, that there's no, let's say, special attention paid to the needs of the people in these areas, or that it is addressed, but as a cross-cutting issue or in a fragmented or uncoordinated way by several different organizations. Usually, that is at least my knowledge, this is due to the fact that either there's a lack of budget designated to humanitarian organizations so that they are not able to have a look after all the needs that the people have, and energy, as it is not covered in this cluster approach, sometimes is just not taken care of. Sometimes there's a lack of implementation of developmental approaches in humanitarian situations, even if they are protracted. Depending on context and organization, sometimes there's a lack of awareness of the importance of energy in humanitarian situations, although I have the feeling that during the last couple of, let's say, 5 years, this has changed a lot, also due to international initiatives that are trying to raise this awareness. So let's have a quick look at why energy is important in times of greatest need, although not explicitly mentioned in the cluster approach. Most of us will know that energy is a need for example, food security, because as we know, 95% of the staple foods must be cooked prior to consumption. So if you don't have access to cooking energy, you might not be able to cook your food. This might lead in a lot of cases to bartering or selling of food rations. So people skip one meal per day and in order to be able to cook the other one. The relevance of energy for economic development is manifold, but of course also depends on the possibilities of refugees to engage in economic activities. But as we all usually look at refugees and host communities, this is very relevant too, because the fuel costs in a lot of settings is very high in comparison to other household expenses. And additionally, especially for women, the lack of time they have because they have to collect firewood from far distances is significant. Lack of electricity leads to diminished options for income generating activities, especially when you want to use or would need to use machines or solar irrigation for agriculture, for example. And lack of light leads to economic activities only during daytime. Looking at education, of course, lighting of schools is important, especially when you look at settings where you need to give double shift teaching and who would like to use the facilities of the schools for teaching after sunset. And of course, there's a lack of information technologies if you don't have access to electricity. Then health is a really burning issue because indoor air pollution is responsible for the premature death of some 20,000 displaced people. That's the numbers of 2014 because of the respiratory and heart afflictions caused by cooking inside of the houses. And then the other area where electricity is needed for the health sector is electrification of health facilities in order to be able to cool medicines, vaccines, or to use equipment that needs electricity. Then Fiona has been mentioning this aspect already, the impact on climate and environment. In a lot of areas where there is a high influx of refugees, deforestation is being observed due to a high demand of firewood and charcoal for cooking. And of course, there's emissions from freestone fires and kerosene lamps that are not as small as one might imagine. One really difficult area is the potential for conflict between host communities and refugees due to the competition for scarce resources. This also, in a lot of cases, leads to gender-based violence. I try to differentiate different settings, although this is just an example how you could do it in order to see different approaches that could be applied in the energy sector. So when you look at access to energy and the respective approaches, you have the one area where you try to abate root causes of migration. The argument behind that is that the catastrophic living conditions of a lot of people in the world raise the need for them to migrate to other countries or other areas within their country. And if you improve the living conditions, they might have more opportunities for good livelihoods in their hometowns or home areas. So, and as energy is one ingredient in this improvement of living conditions, it has a strong role to, for example, create income generation opportunities or employment, because if you have access to electricity, you might use that for agriculture or non-agriculture activities and earn an income that makes your family have more opportunities. Then when you enable social infrastructures in the sense that they are able to improve their services in health, education, or for example training centers, this changes the range of opportunities people have in a certain region. And of course environmental conditions, if they are improved, that makes the living in this area better. I've also been talking about the implications on especially women who have to walk for a long distance in order to get the firewood. So if cooking situations change, this also improves gender equality, because women might have chances to engage in other activities. Just to put on one side, and gender-based violence might be reduced. So the other type of implementation is in stabilization contexts. That is highly vulnerable situations where you would need rapid support, short and medium-term activities to improve livelihood conditions because of, let's say, disaster or conflict. So you would provide relief items in the energy sector, which is cooking devices, lighting, could be solar lanterns, for example, and respond to enterprise energy needs in order to quickly improve the situation where the people live in. Rehabilitation of infrastructure and services is one part of this, and we would also always consider options to link these activities to durable solutions, because after the first humanitarian, let's say, intervention, we have to see how this can be connected to the to developmental approaches. And then the third area is camps and settlements and protracted crises, where you usually have humanitarian response even after 10 or 20 years, and where we suggest to stronger link activities to developmental approaches, which comprises the support of private sector actors. For example, take enterprises from the capital to the area where refugees and host communities do not have access to energy, and incentivize them to create markets for cook stoves, for solar lanterns, etc., and incentivize the creation of market-based solutions to their problems, because on the humanitarian side you might not have the resources to always supply the people with the goods they need. Then we offer technical and vocational training in order to strengthen the capacities of the people on the ground to take these activities as their own and improve their income generating activities. And this, in the end, hopefully leads to environmentally friendlier activities. And we always apply this with a do no harm approach, because this is in a lot of settings a very sensitive topic. For example, when the host community has as its only income generation activity the charcoal production or selling of wood, and we incentivize refugees to use different fuels. So you have to be very careful to not to put disadvantages on the host community, and instead help them equally as the refugees to gain their livings, to gain their income and create living improvement conditions. So the promotion of productive use of energy is one of the very core elements of the activities that we try to implement. So yes, and the other one, sorry, is introduce renewable energy to UN facility electrification. So one approach is to calculate the need of electricity that UN organizations and the other humanitarian actors on the ground have, and complement diesel generators with renewable energies or even replace them. So when we look at the lessons learned from our let's say standard energy projects, I would like to draw your attention to a couple of topics that are very relevant for implementation for us, and would like to mirror this with the conditions in humanitarian situations. One thing we found is that technology is usually not the most important bottleneck. Always there's room for improvement, that's for sure, but there are reliable and mature renewable energy technologies available. So the challenge is indeed not the technology, but the broad dissemination of proven technologies. And then, of course, in our projects, we find that renewable energy technologies are feasible and can be financially viable under certain conditions, of course. So these conditions, for example, are sufficiently high fuel prices, means no fuel subsidies in order to have a level playing field for renewable energies. It always works in areas where you have unreliable supply of fuel, and in a lot of cases in remote areas where there's no grid coming close. So if you look at camp settings, for example, this is not always comparable because there is fuel subsidies, there is free handout of fuels, and there is not a level playing field for competition and market-based approaches. So this is one of the challenges we really have to address in these settings. The goal and the reason why we do that, of course, always is the poverty alleviation and sustainability of the approaches. So it is very important to, when you look at energy access, to create income generation opportunities with this access to energy, because that makes it more sustainable on the energy side and on the income side. And the measures need to be accompanied, of course, with education and training and business and entrepreneurship training, because only having access to energy does not mean that people become economically active. There's more that is needed for that. And of course, there's no financing without adequate mechanisms. So you have to know the ability and willingness to pay of the people for energy products in order to design financial mechanisms for those energy approaches. So when we look at the principles, I've been mentioning some of them already. I will go through this very quickly. We do always support refugees and host communities in order to not disadvantage some of them, because there's, in a lot of cases, resentment or conflict between different groups, and we would like all people to benefit from the activities that we implement. And of course, excuse me, I have to switch the slide. We put a special attention to the do no harm approach in order to not aggravate situations that they are in. So a quick look at what this might mean for cooking energy. We usually do projects in the areas of the introduction of improved stoves of different designs and different prices in order to meet the needs of the people that are different too. That might include, depending on cooking habits, the implementation of central shared cooking areas and alternative fuels, for example, LPG and briquettes. Of course, LPG is not renewable, but in some cases, and we can deep dive into this later, it might be needed in order to not overexploit the wood resources. Then, in order to complement this, you can increase the sustainability of wood fuel supply and improve the framework conditions for the renewable energies and access to energy, even in camps where there's a lot of restrictions in some cases. Then we involve the private sector. I've been mentioning this before, in order to facilitate their access to these areas and create markets. and the adaptation of financial services for these customers is very important. And wherever this is needed, where there are improved cook stoves already, we introduce measures to improve the quality control. Then if you look at access to electricity in humanitarian situations, this is important for the electrification of institutions, of enterprises and houses, and even the streets, for example, solar street lighting, which you can see on the picture above. Our approaches then offer technical and vocational training. They support the private sector development, improve low-cost solutions, sometimes mobile solutions, depending on the context, and might even lead to the implementation of mini-grids, where there's a need for higher energy consumption. And again, very important, the appropriate financing and payment conditions. So the specific challenges, and I'm coming to an end here, when you draw the lessons learned from our standard projects and transfer them to humanitarian settings, it is difficult at times to integrate medium to long-term market-based approaches in protracted crisis situations and link humanitarian aid with development corporations for a couple of reasons. You are acting in a fragile context, and there's very often a lack of stable structures. That means that things change and you cannot rely, for example, on institutions as intermediaries for certain activities. Market-based approaches, then again, are sometimes difficult in a culture where people have been experiencing humanitarian aid for a lot of years and sometimes generations. So if you have received a stove for free at the beginning and after that are asked to pay for a stove, this might be difficult, and you have to really look into the needs of the people and see what is it that they want in order to really meet their needs. And of course, we want to involve the beneficiaries actively, and this sometimes is difficult because people have been lacking their confidence in how would you say that, in designing their life and changing their life because to the way they've been living for a long time. And of course, the host communities may not always welcome long-term planning support, even governments. They reject this because they consider this as a temporary situation. Thank you very much.
For that
That's
very
not everything for all.
overview of the challenges and the opportunities in the different settings you've been working on, and I look forward to addressing some of those topics in greater depth than in the Q&A session. And with that, I'd like to remind everyone and invite everyone to please pose your questions, make your comments in the chat function on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. We'll switch now from Bonn over to Rome and to Geneva, and so it's my pleasure to invite Andrea and Artu to share your expertise. The floor is yours.
Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're really looking forward at UNHCR to participating in this forum and have been looking forward to being able to share this work that we've done together with the FAO as part of our ongoing partnership. So we're going to present to you today the work that has been done in Uganda as an example of how our UNHCR and FAO partnership is helping us to understand the need for energy in some of these new and very large refugee camps. And that is then informing ongoing programming to how to address these energy needs. So I'll start with the introduction, and then for the technical side, I will hand over to Arturo. So just to give you a bit of a background on Uganda, for those not familiar, there has been an exodus from South Sudan for some time now, beginning in the summer of 2016. At times, refugees were arriving in Uganda at numbers of up to 7,000 a day. The crisis created a huge influx, which has now brought some 300,000 people to Uganda in general, and the population in the refugee camp that we're looking at the moment is looking at 1,185,000 people that are being hosted in Uganda. In northern Uganda, we have a large population in Bidibidi, which is one of the largest camps in the world today. So Bidibidi settlement was one of the first set up to cope with the influx that started last year. And effectively, we had a new city appear in six months. From where there was almost no one. Bidibidi appeared as the largest refugee settlement now at 300,000, almost 300,000. That's our expected final number in Bidibidi once we account for people that are coming and there will be reunited families. 300,000 is our expected final population. At first, with the influx coming in with the land that was available very generously, we were able to have about 50 by 50 meter plots for families. But as the numbers grew, this is now reduced to 30 by 30, which is still an amount of space for people to be able to use for their housing or for small-scale gardens. But as more people come, the pressure on the area is increasing, and we're now having to deal with smaller areas. Biomass energy is what everyone's relying at the moment in terms of all of their energy needs, and the current population is starting to worry that they're having to go further. The host population is worrying that the supplies are dwindling. So this huge influx of people is putting a pressure on the area that they haven't seen before. So when it was clear that we needed to understand more the needs, the energy needs of the population in Bidibidi, we reached out to the FAO, with which we have already an ongoing partnership. The FAO partnership with UNHCR began in 2015, which was also the time when UNHCR was working towards its SAFE strategy for providing energy to refugees. Some of the early work focused on Ethiopia and progressed in developing a technical handbook for assessing wood supplies in these kind of displacement settings. And FAO and UNHCR were able to co-publish that book in 2016 to provide some methodology both for our technicians on the ground and for anyone else who would like to understand the monitoring and the planning of forest resource management in these settings, to be able to provide a more evidence and fact-based basis for energy and reforestation programs. For UNHCR, I mean, we really see the true value of understanding these energy and environmental interventions in terms of need and demand. We know that we have a history of doing energy projects and doing environmental reforestation projects, but we haven't always had the information on which to ensure that these are the right interventions, meeting the needs that are actually there, and able to cope with the demand. So having this methodology that we can now apply more consistently to different settings is also allowing us to build up an evidence base for our broader programming in this area. So we had this one in Uganda, and we're also going to be working together with the FAO on another one in Tanzania later on in the year. And so our goals with working with FAO and Bidibidi was to understand the demand. So this is really the first core of any kind of energy intervention that we do. We need to know what people need. Primarily, the needs tend to be cooking, especially in early emergency settings. But heating can also be a challenge in some cases. And certainly wood fuel is the main basis for the Bidibidi settlement, so we need to understand how much wood fuel people need. We need to understand how people are using their fuel, what the current technology practices are, because that also then informs us if behavioral interventions, if cooking technology interventions are going to be effective, what is the current status of people's understanding and use of cooking. And then we need to look at what's available in the area, what is the wood supply that's there, and how far does that go to meet the needs without becoming depleted. And then all of that ultimately results in recommendations for planning the interventions, both in terms of energy access, promoting energy-saving technologies, and reforestation projects. That information is critical to us. And on this note, I will hand over to Arturo to discuss how the assessment in Bidibidi went, and also what the methodology is more specifically.
Thank you, Andrea, for this overview. This assessment is actually based on a combination of field surveys and remote sensing analysis. And the field team was composed by colleagues from UNHCR, FAO, and the National Forest Authority of Uganda. This assessment builds on the methodology developed in the joint FAO-UNHCR technical handbook that was mentioned also by Andrea. And this study includes three phases. First, we will look at the main results of wood fuel demand, then the result of wood fuel supply, and then finally the integration of these assessments to define relevant linkages, gaps, and opportunities, as well as alternative scenarios. So here you can see the estimated size of household in this study was based on a household survey on a sample of 72 households that were randomly selected. The average number of members in a household is estimated at 5. And in this assessment, refugee households were asked about their experience with cooking systems, type and problems experienced before fleeing to Uganda, and their current situation, as well as we measured the average amount of wood fuel used for cooking and heating in a day. So looking at the current situation, more than 50% of the households in Bidibidi settlement use the traditional three stones fire, but also a considerable proportion of households use as well already improved stoves, and this is of course it's probably also the response, the huge international response that is already in place. But still a lot of is needed, and according to the data, you can see that 97% of the household are using fuel wood as a type of fuel for cooking and heating, and only 3% charcoal. Those are the only type of fuels used in this camp. According to this study, the estimated fuel wood consumption for cooking and heating is of the current population is about 347,000 tons of fuel wood per year. Here, the charcoal is expressed on a fuel wood basis in the table that you can see, in order to have a comparison between fuel wood and charcoal. So it was observed in Bidibidi that much fuel wood is consumed for the preparation of food, but as well for boiling water. Okay, So in terms of main findings of wood fuel supply in Bidibidi settlement, from the field measurements we can see in this table how woody biomass is distributed across each land cover class in terms of number of trees, above ground biomass, deadwood, and number of saplings. So the estimating growth in terms of mean annual increment for each land cover class is actually based on the national biomass study, which provide figures both on a national and agroecological zones basis. Next slide. Okay, here on the left map shows how the land cover the land cover classes are distributed on the land, on the area assigned for this camp. And on the right map, you can see the distribution of woody biomass stock in the target area of Bidibidi. So basically, to estimate and map the available woody biomass resources for wood fuel, the mean annual above ground biomass is applied to each respective land cover class. In the table, you can see the area of each classes, the mean above ground biomass, and just I think we can just now focus on the main result, that is the total above ground biomass stock available in the area assigned to this settlement. So based on the integration of these main results from wood fuel demand and supply assessment, the following future scenarios are developed, and including, of course, then we will include as well in the conclusion some possible intervention to improve energy access, reduce environmental impacts, and as well bring additional benefits such as livelihood opportunities. So the first scenario is without any intervention, and in this case, assuming no change in the refugee population, fuel wood demand remain at 347,000 tons of fuel wood per year, and according to the current above ground biomass of 734,000 tons. And as well the annual growth biomass of 33,000 tons. Well, under this scenario, the woody biomass available in the camp area will be completely depleted within 3 years. So the second scenario is we have to say that we are assuming no change in the population, and this includes the introduction of improved cookstoves. So by assuming that 100% of the household will shift to an improved mat stoves with the 20% of efficiency, we can reduce the demand of wood fuel at 243,000 tons of fuel wood per year. This is still too much, and according also to the annual growth, under this scenario, the settlement area can supply the current refugees population with firewood up to 4 years. So we develop a third scenario, that is the one that includes both the tree plantation and improved stoves. And by planting trees, fast-growing trees, in combination with the introduction of improved cookstoves, we can actually have a concrete impact by reducing the environmental impacts, and as well improve the energy access in the refugee camp. So by planting between 9,300 and 12,000 hectares of fast-growing species, and assuming, of course, a successful productive tree planting, this would provide a sustainable source of fuel wood for the existing population. However, these involve considerable costs, land ownership issues, expertise, forest management, and that are all important issues to be considered. Okay, so in conclusion, a combination of interventions is required to reduce the high wood fuel demand from the refugees population of Bidibidi settlement, and as well to sustainably improve the wood fuel supply. So this includes, for instance, several possible interventions, such as we can reduce the demand through introducing fuel-efficient cookstove and promoting energy savings measures at household levels, but as well promoting alternative energy sources, such as agricultural residues, for instance, to produce briquettes or LPG. On the other side, we can see some relevant intervention to improve supply, and in particular the establishment of multi-purpose tree plantation programs for building resilience and creating livelihood opportunities, and as well planning forest rehabilitation and management plans in consultation, of course, with the local and national authorities, as well as with host and refugee communities. Okay, I think maybe Andrea, you might want to add something on top in this final, in the last slides, in the conclusion.
Thank you very much for that coverage of the methods and the conclusions used in Uganda. So I think everyone can see how we're getting really solid and very specific advice from these kind of assessments that we can draw on FAO's experience and expertise, which we don't necessarily have in-house at UNHCR. And looking at our conclusions panel here, what it particularly allows us to do is, from an evidence base, advocate for these multi-part fuel combination solutions. We often face from non-specialists saying, well, if people are using trees, just plant some more trees. Like, trees grow, how hard can it be? But having this kind of information on how much land, for example, would be needed, upwards of 10,000 hectares to solely supply firewood for a population of the size of Bidibidi, allows us to advocate for alternative fuels, more fuel-efficient cookstoves, as Arturo noted. And it also helps us to plan our forest rehabilitation programming that we do have to be at a scale that's meaningful. And so this kind of information is really moving forward and professionalizing the kind of environment and energy interventions that UNHCR can do, thanks to this partnership with FAO. Thank you very much, and I think that's all from my side.
Thank you both for speaking about your work, and we'll stay in Rome for our third presentation, our fourth speaker, but we're going to switch from Uganda to Sudan and hear about the work of the World Food Programme there. So the floor is yours, Daphne.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for the introductions, and I am here today to speak a little bit about WFP's work on safe access to fuel and energy, as well as give an example on our largest SAFE program to date in Darfur, Sudan, with some of the impacts we have measured there, and provide an overview of the lessons learned, some challenges we encountered, the way forward, as well as a set of tools we have available not only for WFP internally, but also for a wider audience that we hope can be very helpful for the people listening in other agencies and people working in this area. I briefly wanted to start with a bit of an introduction on why WFP is working on safe programs. And it's actually a very simple explanation. When we look at ending hunger and securing or food security for people in the operations that we work in, energy is of a massive impact. Without energy, without access to cooking fuel, people are unable to simply cook the food we provide or the food that they have access to themselves. What we see is that people are undercooking their food, they're skipping meals, they're selling part of their food rations to purchase a little bit of fuel to cook the remaining parts of the food that they have available, and numerous other risks and challenges that come along that we have heard today. So with this in mind, WFP started to work on the program Safe Access to Fuel and Energy in 2009, and with the launch of 6 pilot programs. And I'm happy to say that with a lot of work on mainstreaming energy into our operations, today we have reached over more than 6 million people in 18 countries with SAFE. And we're hoping to further scale it up to 10 million people by 2020. But when we talk about SAFE, what are we actually talking about in terms of interventions? I'm sorry, I'm just going to go to the next slide if possible. Yes. The SAFE program at WFP adopted really follows a holistic approach in which there's an innovative combination of energy and livelihood related interventions. And in the visual you see in front of you, I have outlined the key interventions that we focus on in our SAFE programs. So that is fuel efficient stoves. Now, when we look at fuel-efficient stoves, this is a core component, but it's not just a procure and distribution model. Oftentimes what we do, and it's actually one of the interventions we have in Sudan, which I will get back to, is we teach and train people how to either assemble stoves or how to produce and manufacture their own stoves. That could be mud stoves or clay stoves, which, if they're used correctly, can have up to 40% fuel efficiency. What we also do to really focus on reducing firewood consumption and firewood dependency is look into alternative types of cooking fuel. This can include fire fuel briquettes or biogas installations where enough livestock and water is available, which can also have a number of other additional benefits beyond maybe complementing firewood use or eliminating it altogether. Safe and sustainable livelihoods is a big factor within our programs. Not only can the lack of access to energy, as we've learned, reduce people's ability to focus on income-generating activities, for example, through just the sheer number of hours that people are spending on collecting firewood, but it also has some beautiful benefits when looking at energy interventions. People can produce the stoves and fire fuel briquettes in a way that's not only beneficial for them to use in their households, but, for example, start selling at markets and also spreading with that awareness about alternative methods of cooking meals. Another income-generating activity, and I'm going through the next block there, is natural resource management. Natural resource management can not only help people get a better understanding of how they can collect firewood in a way that is less harmful for the trees. We also include elements of tree nurseries, building community forests with income-generating trees. In Darfur, this is, for example, very successfully done through Arabic gum, which is harvested and sold by the participants of the SAFE program. Again, looking at Sudan, gender-based violence is unfortunately a big risk for the women collecting firewood, as they have to go out in very dangerous environments. And some of the program elements incorporate training and awareness raising specifically in this area. And lastly, we look at fuel for education. When we look from WFP's perspective and we incorporate school meals, especially maybe moving towards homegrown school meals, the different meals people can receive in schools have a different impact on the energy needs of, sorry, I'm just going to skip back quickly, of the different energy needs for schools. So when we increase the need for cooked meals, we are also increasing the pressure on the schools to have cooking fuel. With installations such as biogas installations or all the other elements that we have in our program, we can reduce these firewood needs. We can also reduce maybe even children's time for firewood collection in the afternoon, because their households are less dependent on firewood, and this is time that they can spend attending education. So this is a quick overview of some of the key interventions that are part of our SAFE program. And I want to move towards, as I said, our largest program to date of SAFE, which is in Darfur, Sudan. So in 2009, WFP started a SAFE program in the northern region of Darfur, and we moved towards all of the regions in Darfur in 2014. I'm going to talk about an impact analysis we have done over the period of 2014 to 2016 with some of the results and some of the lessons learned from this. Now, to provide a little bit of context about the situation in Darfur, Sudan, there has been for well over 10 years an ongoing conflict. This is one of WFP's most complex humanitarian operations to date. We have over 2.5 million internally displaced people. There has been a breakdown of markets, loss of food stocks. It has been completely disruptive of people's lives there. That, in combination with ongoing droughts and increased dependency in some areas of natural resources shared by an increased number of people because of displacement, there is a very dire situation when it comes to firewood access. So when we look at the objectives of SAFE interventions in this area, we really focused on the improvement of access to energy services for cooking for people, but also looking at the reduction of the vulnerability of especially the women and children going out to venture firewood towards gender-based violence. We're looking at the improvement of environmental conditions, as the environments of people in multiple regions in Darfur are very severe, and as well as enhancing the livelihoods of people, of households, to support their food security and build their resilience. And this is aimed at both internally displaced people, populations, as well as host communities. The impact analysis from 2014 to 2016 touches on a couple of different elements which I want to go over briefly. So, for example, the access to energy, that was one of the objectives of the program. We see that the program had significant impacts on the access to energy, and over 350,000 households were able to benefit from the use of fuel-efficient stoves. Even over 700,000 people were reached through the production of biofuel briquettes. So these were briquettes that were made from agricultural waste and were oftentimes complementing or completely replacing people's firewood needs in a household for cooking. And with these activities, there was a total of 40% of reduction in firewood consumption per household. Now, when we then look at the protection element of that, with SAFE, we cannot say that we directly impact or contribute to a reduction in gender-based violence. However, what we are able to do is reduce the time people spend collecting firewood and are being exposed to these risks. What we've also seen is that there has been a significant impact of the gender-based violence awareness raising campaigns, and that over 90,000 women have been involved in these efforts. When we look at the environmental improvements that came out of the program, we saw that there was a total firewood consumption savings associated with the fuel-efficient stove use of about 180,000 tons, which was caused by displacing the open fires and people actually cooking now on fuel-efficient stoves. This also resulted in corresponding reduction in deforestation of about 15,000 acres of forest land per annum, which means a total energy savings of about 3.8 tons, and the aggregate avoided emissions of 345,000 tons a year. What we also saw, and actually that was one of the strongest links and outcomes from this impact analysis, was the impact on people's livelihoods and food securities. As said, there were a number of different activities, including the improved agricultural practices, food processing, building of fuel-efficient stoves, building of the production of briquettes that people could use. And let me quickly go to the right slide here. And we saw that a significant number of households were actually able to receive an influx in income due to these activities. We saw that they were able to spend their money not as much on firewood, but also use these additional funds to purchase additional food, to spend money on household durables, on education, etc. One other beautiful outcome of this project was the way SAFE is set up in Darfur is that we created SAFE centers. SAFE centers were the place where the participants came together to receive all the trainings, where the community forestry was started, where they received the training on production of stoves, etc. And from this, women's groups were formed, and through these women groups it was also easier for women to start small businesses and work together to really make this a business, to take all of the trainings, to use all of the assets that were created through this program and become small business entrepreneurs. This will also take me to the lessons learned and the way forward. Because while we've seen a lot of great impacts from these interventions, there are also a lot of challenges during the way. One of the, or a couple of the main challenges were the limited partner capacity. When we're talking about energy interventions, and this links to a challenge down the line, we see that there's not only often a lack of capacity, but also of technical expertise. And these items are really essential to ensure the scale up and sustainability of these programs. There's also a bigger need of specific safe M&E tools, as well as a baseline and feasibility study ahead of implementing these programs. While we have done this in the beginning, we saw that there were definitely some changes we could make to that to really help us design better programs. And lastly, the post-program follow-up. It's because sometimes of the way we're structured, but post-program follow-up is not always included in the way we would like to. When we're looking at specific programs for SAFE, we do see that there's very much a need of follow-up with the participants to understand if it's still going right. When we look at biogas installations, are there any problems that occur 1 year down the line? Do they need extra training, etc.? So when we look at the way forward, we're really going to focus on partner capacity building, the reinforcement of specific SAFE monitoring and evaluation tools, on more on training and operating and maintaining biogas units. So focus on follow-up training and put dedicated time towards that. But also post-program follow-up and monitoring when we're, for example, looking at the business women who are starting their own businesses with these stoves and briquettes and other assets that were built. Do we need to provide access to microfinance for them to continue this? Do they need additional tools and education along the way for them to keep going? I want to wrap this up with that, but before I want to hand it over back to Fiona, I have here a slide with some of the tools available in WFP Safe Handbook. Now, in 2012, WFP launched a SAFE-specific handbook, which is available not only for WFP, but for agencies and individuals and practitioners worldwide, that encompasses from A to Z how people can start with the implementation of safe interventions or other energy-related interventions. A quick overview, as you can see here, is that it will include a number of tools when it comes to assessment, on the designing and planning of these programs, on the implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and of course also important communications tools that can help at maybe resource mobilization and advocacy for the purposes. Now, if you want to see all of these tools and have access to these tools, you can find the handbook on wfp.org/safe, but also a quick Google search if you don't have the link anymore on WFP Safe Handbook and you will find it. I hope this has been very helpful for people interested in this or already working on this, and please reach out to us if there are any questions on any of the items that have been presented.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for that insight into your work. As you can see from the chat and from the comments that Iqbal Farouk has been making about the FAO's work with the Rohingya influx and crisis, the issue we're discussing, the needs that we're seeking to address, and the practical examples we're sharing couldn't be more timely. So on that note, I'll take this opportunity to invite you to use the chat function to post some more questions. And in the meantime, I've got some already up my sleeve. I'll turn to Arturo, if I may, because we've had a very concrete question, whether you could please provide examples of fast-growing tree species that are also energy efficient, and that could combine very well with fuel-efficient cook stoves. Arturo, do you have any examples from your work?
Thanks, Fiona. So, well, the right answer really depends on a large number of factors. So, I would say that given species, it's difficult to provide just an example for the case of Bidibidi, but we would definitely need an in-depth assessment. Actually, a given species might grow very well in a location and might fail a few hundred meters further because of the soil, the topography change, availability of water, and so on. So I would say that for a successful forest intervention, it is really important to know the local conditions and the specific needs of a given species before deciding what can be planted. So let's say that by looking at the characteristics of an ideal tree for energy purpose, we should consider tree species with high growth rate and the ability for coppicing, as well as to grow in dense stands, and of course to produce a good quality fuel wood. So those are some of the main issues, the characteristics that we should consider in selecting the right species. And then, of course, we can provide examples, but really we should consider something specific for at least for whether we are looking at dry areas or humid areas, and as that can be completely different species.
Thank you very much, Arturo. I hope that answered your question, George. But staying with you, Arturo, if I may, if we zoom out from that one question around specific tree species, moving more broadly to the main barriers and the challenges in successfully implementing reforestation projects or reforestation interventions. Do you have a bit of an overview where colleagues can learn from your experiences in the field and sort of start to assess, okay, this is what we need to look out for, these are issues we'll definitely need to address when we move into such interventions? What are your key lessons learned?
Okay, I think that as I said, I just highlight some of the main characteristics that we should look at when we want to select a species for fuel, but for energy purposes. But then, of course, we should consider that in forest rehabilitation and reforestation, we might have as well other purpose to be considered, such as protection, environmental protection, agroforestry, and soil protection and so on.
I was just wondering if you've got a bit of a sort of, do's and don'ts, 2-3 tips for colleagues when it comes to reforestation, given the fuel needs in refugee settings, in camps, anything that you would say from your work with colleagues that you say, okay, do look out for this, do look out for that.
Yes. I think that as I said, that those are the main characteristics to look at for field purposes. So it's really important to have very in-depth studies and surveys in the sites in order to have successful forestry operation.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions now for Andrea and for Anya. And I'm just checking the chat for additional questions. We'll pick up on that request from you, Regina, shortly. So, Andrea, UNHCR, we've got the question here about your experiences, the organization's experiences, rather, in harnessing non-traditional sources of funding and in working with the private sector to address the energy needs of refugees, of internally displaced populations and of host communities. How are you tapping into those other sources of funding? How are you collaborating with other organizations, specifically the private sector, to help you meet those very large needs, those very real needs of displaced populations, of refugees as well? Andrea, if you'd like to share UNHCR's experience, and then I'll reframe that a little for you, Anya, afterwards.
So from UNHCR, and I can only talk about our energy and environment programming here, because we do, of course, have a lot of partnerships with non-traditional donors and private sectors for lots of other needs. But in terms of providing energy and environment services, it's actually quite new for us. We do work with lots of non-country level donors, for example, for our energy. So we get a lot of support for IKEA Foundation that allows us to test new technologies and do pilot trials to see what kinds of energy interventions are going to work for refugees. So we have done a lot of work with IKEA in Ethiopia and Rwanda. In terms of the private sector, we're actually just testing a partnership with private sector in Cameroon on the reforestation side. So we're looking at a private sector company, they're a social enterprise that specializes in reforestation and reforestation. So this is going to be our first pilot trial on a reforestation that's actually led by private sector and supported by UNHCR. We're of course looking to expand our partnerships more widely, but it's something that is quite new for UNHCR. So we're doing some pilot testing and then seeing where we can expand on things that are working.
That sounds like some exciting work and some innovative approaches that UNHCR is testing there. Maybe we'll have the opportunity to find out more about them, Andrea, at a later date.
For the one in Cameroon, we hope in about a year we'll be able to share some exciting.
Okay, careful. We'll hold you to that one. Picking up on Regina's request, she's asking whether there's a guide that helps decide on which design of a fuel-efficient stove is most appropriate for which context. So is there any evidence about the amount of fuel that different designs can also save? I'm going to throw that request out into the round amongst our participants and also amongst our presenters. Has anyone got any experience, any concrete examples to answer that request?
Yes, we do have some experience with this, and as we all know, it's not a one-size-fits-all, unfortunately, with cook stove selection and technology. So within WFP, we're working with sort of a procurement checklist, so to say, to really decide on which stove and which fuel would be most appropriate. And what we do, I will try to see if I can share it later, but what we basically go through is a list of steps from geography. Is it in a high area? Is it a low area? The boiling points are different. What type of stoves and fuels would make most sense? Type of technology, is it too complex? Does it fit with the cooking traditions? Does it fit with the pot? If people are cooking in Jira on very big pots, we cannot have maybe a very small stove, or maybe the type of fuel would need to be able to cook for a very long time, and sometimes it's just a short amount of intense heat. Of course, we're also looking at the fuels that are available or might become available depending on the different technology that we select, so that we do have some kind of an overview for that can help in the decision making. And I know at the same time the Set for Food initiative have an online tool on decision making for both fuel as well as stove technologies as well, so we can share the link on that later. I hope that is helpful.
I have a question for you, Anya. In your presentation, you were speaking about the role of the private sector and how market-based approaches are being looked at. Could you maybe talk a bit about your experience also coming from the development context within GIZ about working with market-based approaches, about working with the private sector in the energy context? What sort of positive or negative experiences, what sort of challenges and opportunities have you got to share? It seems from the questions and comments that I'm seeing from participants, something that is being touched on, that role that the private sector, be it local or international, can play.
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe first of all, the private sector is one of the, I think, very necessary stakeholders in energy, in developing energy access markets, because as we have seen even in humanitarian crisis, after a while, the support that you can get from the humanitarian financing is not sufficient for that. So it's very necessary to incentivize the private sector to fulfill maybe a leading role in the sector. Our experience is that you have to approach this involvement of private sector from two sides. One is you work with the supply side. So this can be either help to create enterprises and production schemes for stoves, distribution schemes for solar lanterns, marketing campaigns for these products, etc., in order to have sufficient supply of the exact stoves that you need. And then we come back to the question before, which is the stove that you need. And even in very marginal areas, it is helpful to offer different types of stoves, because people, they like to choose between different models, and they have an idea about how it should look like, for example. All the other aspects we take into consideration as well, but also the design of a stove is important. So it makes a difference to people if it is an aspirational good or not. So if they see it looks good, it is efficient, it is clean, and whatever selling point they are interested in, you have to kind of offer different models and for different purchasing power levels as well. And then if you want to incentivize the private sector to increase the supply in the market, you can, for example, apply approaches with, for example, result-based financing, where you could model cases where those enterprises that sell the most stoves in a certain region, or the most efficient stoves or the cleanest stoves in the biggest number, they get incentives, for example, for the purchase of other inputs they need, or for trainings, etc. So they get the incentives after they prove that they can sell a lot of products. And then you kind of strengthen the most successful actors in the market. These are just some approaches on the supply side. And then, of course, you have the demand side, where you could work with awareness-raising campaigns in order to make obvious the advantages of improved stoves, of different fuels, etc., and support the users and the customers so that they will want the products that the market displays, basically. So this is just a couple of hints in this area.
Thank you very much, Anya. But there we're already seeing what sort of a holistic approach is needed to encourage uptake, to encourage other important stakeholders, as you say, to play a role in those often challenging situations. So I'll turn back to the colleagues in Rome and ask whether they have considered their answer to the question from Andreas on WFP and FAO cooperation and coordination in the Uganda displacement crisis. Just to repeat that question for our colleagues, Andreas was wondering how FAO and the WFP can work together and how they can complement each other in the context of the Uganda displacement crisis to help support energy needs.
Good afternoon again. This is Daphne. We had some time to think about our answer. Thank you for that. I think we can take it maybe even a little bit broader and not just focus on Uganda, because in every situation it's very different where our strengths are, particularly in that country. But what we do, and that moves actually beyond just WFP and FAO, also includes UNHCR and many other partners, for example, is our collaboration through the Safe Global Working Group. And this global working group, where at this moment the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves, FAO and WFP are co-chairing, is a consortium of partners that are really focused on enhancing partnerships on energy interventions, on sharing knowledge, on sharing best practices, on developing tools, and also finding the right partnerships in the right locations. So oftentimes we know, or oftentimes, almost all of the times, we know where other partners are working, what kind of challenges they face, which areas they are working on, and can look within our organizations and agencies and see what can we bring in value to that intervention there. Are there areas for partnerships and collaboration? Is there data or analysis that we can share so we avoid duplication? Can we put together multiple programs, again, to avoid duplication? And I think that is one very concrete example of how we work together as multiple agencies on this issue. Thank you.
Many thanks, Daphne, for sharing that. And I think that's a good note to end on today, underlining as it does the need for partnership, for well-attuned, locally responsive solutions that draw on various institutions' expertise and experience, but are tailored to local needs. That brings challenges, as we've heard from the very illustrative, very practical examples that have been shared today, the need to engage stakeholders, the ambition to encourage and enable livelihoods, different challenges in the very varied local circumstances that we find when we look to the issue of safe access to fuel and energy, when we look to energy and migration. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our presenters for sharing their contributions, and to thank you, our participants, both for joining us and for sharing your questions. Just some housekeeping before we close to reassure you that any information that you've requested in the chat box, any questions that you feel have been unanswered, they'll be picked up in the report on the Q&A section. And as I mentioned at the outset, you'll all be provided with a link with a recording of today's webinar to furnish you with all the details once again, so you can re-access the presentations and tap into the wealth of expertise, experience and materials that augment our work. So on that note, many thanks, and please do also fill in our feedback survey. The link will be in the chat box, and you can click on that right away to help us find out from your thoughts what you found positive to help us improve on our next webinars. There's more information on the core platform, the knowledge sharing platform on resilience. And on that note, my thanks and goodbye.